So welcome in the name of the MAGI Research Group, which is currently coordinating the Human Rights Discussion Group at the Max Planck Institute for International Law in Heidelberg. I'm very pleased today that we're going to be having a discussion on lessons learned from the World Cup in regards to human rights. We have two speakers here, which will get a very good conversation going, namely Dr. James Dorsey and Max Tuñón. I will ask them in a moment to introduce themselves because I think that will do them more justice, but I can already announce that I think this is a very good constellation of speakers because we have a political scientist and journalist, as well as someone actually representing an organization which is very closely linked or affected and involved in the ongoing discussion on human rights, labor rights from the ILO. So James, may I ask you to perhaps briefly just introduce yourself, and then we'll ask Max next.
Sure. I'm a journalist. I was a foreign correspondent for 40 years, and I'm currently an adjunct senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. For the last 13 years, one of the things that I've been doing is I've been looking at the nexus of politics, sports, and society in the Middle East. I published 2 books on it. And obviously, as a result of Qatar being awarded the 2022 World Cup hosting rights in December 2010, Qatar was one, not the only, but one major element in what I've been looking at over the past decade.
Thank you very much, James. So that gives us an idea of what perspective you'll be coming from and also the contributions you'll be making. And then Max, if I could just ask you to briefly introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Katerina. Thanks for organizing this exchange. My name is Max Tuñón. I'm the head of the ILO Project Office in Qatar. The International Labour Organization has been working with the state of Qatar as well as social partners and other partners since 2018 to support a wide-ranging number of labor reforms. Personally, I've also been working on this issue around labor migration in particular for over 15 years, mostly in Asia, before this working in South Asia, looking at migration to the Gulf, but from the other side of the corridor. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So as you can already hear, we've got 2 very different takes, or let's say approaches, and also experience what regards our topic for today. I'm also very happy to see among the participants there's quite a spectrum of organizations, institutes, but also expertise represented. So welcome to all the guests who joined today. Thank you for listening today. And the way we'd like to proceed is that both James and Max will give a short statement on maybe the thoughts and the topics they've been dealing with before, maybe leading up to the World Cup, but also since then. And maybe the World Cup doesn't even take center stage, but for us that was kind of a point of departure then to start a conversation. And then after both of our speakers have given their statements, the 3 of us will have a conversation, follow up on some of the topics that they mention, and then after that we'll open up the floor for further discussions. So Max, perhaps you would like to go first to give a short statement on your experience and maybe also some points of focus you would like to address.
Sure. I think it might be useful to provide a little bit of an overview about or background to the work of the ILO and also how we set up the program in Qatar, how we work in Qatar. As I said, we're approaching 5 years since the opening of the office here, but actually the story precedes 2018 in that in 2013, 2014, under the ILO supervisory mechanism, the international trade unions made a complaint that Qatar was not fulfilling its obligations with regards to international labor standards that it had ratified, particularly on forced labor. And these allegations were upheld by an independent committee of experts and other bodies. And after a series of exchanges and a long period of negotiation, we developed a program of work, not only the government of the ILO and Qatar, but also the International Trade Union Confederations, as well as the International Employers, to establish an office that would support comprehensive labor reforms in Qatar. At the center of these reforms are the changes to the kafala system. The kafala system, which tied a worker to an employer and therefore created multiple dependencies and the opportunities for exploitation. In addition to that, other reforms around wages, access to justice, occupational safety and health, etc. And indeed, in the past 5 years, we've seen many of these legislation or legislative changes have a direct impact on the lives of hundreds of thousands of workers. At the same time, there is still a lot of work to be done. We know this. This assessment that I'm providing is based not only on administrative data that we have access to, but also survey data based on research that we've commissioned. It's based on exchanges with workers on a near daily basis. One of the functions of this office is to receive complaints from workers, whether that's in person, by email, by phone. So that helps us to keep a close eye on where the gaps in implementation and enforcement lie. This also comes from engagement with employers, as well as ongoing conversations with the government to see, okay, when we're putting forward suggestions on how systems can be improved, we can see the degree of appetite to indeed bringing about these changes. So I feel like we have a unique perspective on this, in that we are working here on the ground in Qatar and able to see progress. Progress in the sense that when we talk about the kafala reforms, in 2 years since these changes were introduced from September 2020 to the subsequent 2 years, over 350,000 workers changed jobs. When we talk about the minimum wage legislation, 13% of the workforce, or 280,000 workers, saw their wages increased to this new minimum threshold. And when we talk about safety and health, for example, there is legislation on occupational heat stress, which we've got data that shows that it's led to quite a steep decline in the number of patients admitted to clinics with heat-related disorders each summer in the past few years. So there is plenty of evidence to show that reforms are having an impact on a large number of workers. In fact, some of the data that we commissioned ourselves to a research institution here found that one of the top line findings of that research was that 86% of respondents, low wage workers, felt that the reforms had a positive impact on the lives of migrant workers. That study also shows gaps and shortcomings in implementation and enforcement, but we can definitely see that there has been positive impact. In terms of the 3 priorities going forward, where we see the main gaps still, one relates to, when some workers try to change jobs, they face pushback, they face retaliation from employers. Retaliation that can take the form of canceling their residency permits, filing absconding charges against them, threatening them with deportation. And that still happens to an extent, but we're working with the government to put in place procedures that would prevent this from happening. And so we see some positive movement in this regard. Secondly, is the issue of wage protection. It's still a major issue where workers now they have much better access to complaints mechanisms. They can file complaints online, and indeed, in a 12-month period, about 36,000 workers filed complaints online with the labor ministry. Most of these are wage related. So they have access to complaints mechanisms. There are labor courts that have been established since 2018, 2019. But the time it takes for workers to recover their wages and go through this process is still too long. So our priority is how we can streamline this process, how workers can recover their wages either from their employer or from a government established fund. And then a third urgent priority for us relates to the protection of the rights of domestic workers. This is, again, new legislation was introduced just over 5 years ago on the subject for the first time, recognizing domestic work as work. The nature of the work presents a number of unique circumstances. Obviously, it's beyond the remit of the labor inspectorate. Work is carried out behind closed doors. This is considered around the world to be, the private sphere. So, it requires special attention. Indeed, also a very sensitive area of work, but nevertheless, really important, and therefore one of our top priorities. There are other priorities, there are other positive developments, but I don't think we have time to go into all of them. So all that to say is that, maybe some introductory remarks, that indeed we've seen a very positive trajectory over the past 5 years. And like everybody, we are impatient to see, the laws fully implemented and fully enforced. But we recognize that it does take time. It's not that you can just flick the switch and then overnight the laws are implemented perfectly. A number of new institutions have been established, and these are new, institutions that require capacity building for staff, procedures, raising awareness among workers as well as employers, as well as government officials about what these new procedures are and systems are. And even changing mindsets of among employers, management, even workers, about the dynamics between workers and employers. These are deeply entrenched practices or dynamics that have been in place for decades. And so, the changes have been brought about to kind of redress, to an extent, the imbalance of power between workers and employers is not something that will happen overnight either. Again, to emphasize that we are impatient to bring about change and continue down this trajectory, but also we recognize that it can't be done immediately. It does take time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Max, for that a good first impression of the work that you've been doing and what you've been observing. And then I would ask James to also give his first statement. Sorry, James, you are still muted. Yeah, okay, now we can hear you. Yes.
Right. If I may, I'm going to take a broader sweep than Max did for obvious reasons. I think, of course, post-mortem of the Qatar World Cup, and particularly of the campaign, the rights campaigns, whether that referred to workers' rights, whether that referred to human rights, whether that referred to LGBTQ rights, is important for two reasons. One, to my mind, this was probably the most intense campaign by human rights groups and trade unions related to a mega sports event in recent history, as far as I can see. And this is probably the beginning, not the end. All the more so with countries like Saudi Arabia bidding for basically anything and everything under the sun, and being reasonably successful in that. To my mind, there are serious lessons or questions, lessons to be raised, lessons to be learned from the Qatari campaign. And I don't know that I have an answer to all the questions, but nonetheless, they're relevant questions. In my mind, obviously the campaign was in many ways, as Max detailed, very successful, or successful, certainly in terms of labor rights. The one thing I would say on labor rights, but that goes to the more broader point I want to make, which is that you need to be realistic about what is achievable and how it's achievable. So with other words, all of the issues that Max was talking about are issues that fundamentally don't challenge the system. When you come to other issues, which were incorporated certainly in the trade unions, and for understandable reasons, such as collective bargaining or independent trade unions, those are demands that fundamentally challenge the political structure of the country. And it was obvious that those demands were not going to be met. overall, my feeling is that the human rights groups and the trade unions, to a lesser degree, but nonetheless, didn't differentiate between what was possible and what was not possible. I think that's one. Two, again, in my mind, the debate over the last decade about Qatar, and let's be clear, there are legitimate issues on all of the rights questions, whether that's labor, whether that's human, whether that's LGBTQ. But the debate about Qatar was, as far as I'm concerned, skewed by bias, by prejudice, and by sour grapes. And we can get into that in greater detail. But one of the things that both of you, certainly the human rights groups, and to my mind, the trade unions, but Max may want to correct me on this if I'm wrong, did very little, if anything at all, to distance themselves from criticism of Qatar that really had nothing to do with the rights issue and had a lot to do with prejudice, bias, or sour grapes from some of the other bidders. Now, that's not to say, to be clear, that the debate about the integrity of the Qatari bid was not legitimate. And there are serious questions about the integrity of the bid, but that goes to the broader question of corruption in sports and the way that FIFA operated, certainly up until the awarding of the hosting rights to Qatar in 2010. I also think there was a I also think there was a somewhat Western-centric approach, certainly again on the part of the human rights groups. And again, that's not to say that values are not universal; they are universal. But nonetheless, I think there was something of a Western approach. And one area where in my mind, you see that is that the focus has been the focus has always been on global mega sporting events, be it the World Cup, be it the Olympic Games. It's not been, for example, what are far more frequent and not less important in my mind, Asian sports. If you look at what Saudi Arabia is planning in terms of either its bids or its bids that it has won over the next 7 years up until 2030, there is only one potential bid that is global, and that is the 2030 World Cup in a joint bid with Egypt and Greece. All the other multiple tournaments, whether it's Asian Games, Asian Cup, Asian Winter Games, are all Asian. And the question is, why aren't they part of that focus? I also think, when I was saying Western-centric, I think there was an element of not really taking into account local sentiment, if you wish. And I'll end on this one saying, migrant rights were not really a major issue. There is a sense, and I think there's a part of that is true, that the Qataris, on the one hand, had to be brought into or sort of dragged into all of this, and they could have been far more proactive on all kinds of issues. And I think they would have benefited from being proactive. But as I earlier mentioned, worker rights were not a really deep-seated, passionate issue in Qatar. And Max can, if he thinks I'm wrong, he can comment on that. LGBTQ issues are. And and my reading is that even if you would have enforced top-down recognition of LGBTQ rights, the majority of the population would not have accommodated that. And you see that in countries like Turkey and Indonesia, where LGBTQ are not violations of the law. And yet those are very socially sensitive situations. So with other words, achieving progress is going to have to be a process. It's not going to happen overnight. And it's going to have to be done in a way in which you get a public buy-in. And there was very little understanding of that, at least as far as I can see, in terms of the way various activist groups approached Qatar. Let me end it on here, and we can pick up a lot of this in discussion.
All right, thank you, James. Is there, Max, anything you'd like to directly react to, perhaps, or follow up on what James was saying?
I think, yeah, I think it's just one thought that, we should, there is a distinction between the roles of some of the different actors involved. For a long time, the trade unions have been actively involved in this program. They meet twice a year with the Ministry of Labor and the ILO to discuss, what are the priorities for the next 6 months, what are the shortcomings that they've observed, how they can be addressed, enhanced, etc. And also they have what we call community liaison officers here on the ground, based on the ground, the global union federations. So some are involved, not all are involved. There is relationships, have changed over time as well. But there is a distinction, obviously, that needs to be made among different trade unions as well as different NGOs. Some that have been engaging with the government, some that have been more focused on campaigning, some that focus more on research and policy advice. It's really, not surprisingly, a diverse group of actors.
All right, thank you. So something the two of you were both kind of hinting at is that it also depends when we look at lessons learned or where to go from here. Of course, we need to differentiate lessons learned by whom. And so, James, maybe you could say a little something about the other state. I mean, you've now mentioned Saudi Arabia as well, but other states, perhaps what they've also been adopting for themselves in terms of campaigning for such events, for example, or just other lessons learned perhaps by states in terms of, either campaigning for such sports mega events, but also for other events to be hosted in their countries. Perhaps you could say something about that.
Let me, if I may add, come at this from a different perspective, pick up on what Max just said. I think it's important to look at the process over the last 12, 13 years. The Qataris in December 2010 never expected the avalanche of criticism that hit them. Their initial response to that was a little bit like an ostrich. Put your head in the sand and it will all blow over. And they ignored those that told them that if you do that, when you pull your head out of the sand, you will have lost the moral high ground. You will be on the defensive. And that's exactly what happened. Now, to the Qataris' credit, once they did pull their head out of the sand, they did something that no other Gulf state has done. And that is they let the activists in. They engaged with the activists. And that was happening at a moment at which academics, journalists were being stopped at airports. Critical academics, critical journalists were being stopped at airports, in some cases at the airport of departure rather than the airport of arrival, and basically banned from the country. And you got a period in Qatar in which Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch were releasing reports and holding news conferences in Doha, and that was really unprecedented. And as Max mentioned, there was engagement with the trade unions, but also with the human rights groups in trying to address the workers' issues. There was engagement in terms of drafting model contracts, in terms of drafting codes of conduct. One of the problems that emerged was also that all of this was done with the World Cup Organizing Committee. And the World Cup Organizing Committee was not a national remit. With other words, they could do, for example, they could impose certain conditions on their contractors and demand that the contractors impose those conditions on subcontractors. But if you were talking about sectors involving construction, for example, on infrastructure that had nothing to do with the World Cup, that's where their remit stopped, and I don't think that that was always understood. I think that the broader question that, and this comes to your question about states, is two things. One, there was the beginning of a process of dealing with workers' rights and the whole issue of the kafala, the sponsor system, that had begun before Qatar won the world rights. I mean, I first started writing about this in 1976, when much of the Western press really wasn't interested in labor issues in the Gulf. I think the broader question in the evaluation of the Qatar World Cup is the question: what is this really about? At least from the perspective of, for example, the Gulf states. Is this about a phrase that I don't use in my writing, but which has become quite common, sports washing? Or is it about much more, and reputational benefits are really only one element in the equation? I think what you're going to see, I mean, my suspicion is that when Saudi Arabia gets taken to task, it will not engage in the way that Qatar has engaged with its critics. It's going to be a much sharper confrontation. And Saudi Arabia, in my mind, will look at two things. It will look at the fact that it suffered, of course, severe reputational damage as a result of human rights issues, and particularly as a result of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist, in 2018. But it will also look at the balance post World Cup in Qatar. And the balance is that Qatar came out of this in reputational terms, perhaps not among segments of the left, perhaps not in the human rights community, but by and large, it came out of this with its reputation enhanced. And in some ways that may reinforce a notion of other states that, will just suffer through it. It doesn't matter.
I may, Katerina, I have one thing I want to pick up from James. Definitely, I agree that when we took, a lot of people thought about Qatar as just the host of the World Cup, or that this program and these labor reforms were just linked to the World Cup. And indeed, it's important to make the distinction that, yes, there was a Supreme Committee organizing the World Cup, which had control over its contractors and subcontractors. That totaled about 35,000 maximum workers at its peak. So less than 2% of the overall workforce. The reforms introduced by the labor ministry that we've been supporting, are really targeting the 2 million migrant workforce overall. One of the good things I'm happy to point to is that in terms of legacy is that we are seeing other institutions, other major public bodies and large contractors taking on what they call the welfare standards, the worker welfare standards of the Supreme Committee, and applying it to their contractors. So there is, in many cases, those go beyond what is required by labor law, and they have their own auditing mechanisms that these public bodies will carry out to ensure compliance with regards to payment of wages or accommodation and other worker welfare issues. So that's been one positive outcome and instrument, the worker welfare standards of the Supreme Committee is certainly an instrument that we've seen continue post World Cup. I would also say that we always emphasize that our work is not necessarily linked directly to the World Cup. We do recognize that all of the international attention and scrutiny that the World Cup brought has accelerated reforms, because the ILO works all over the world, and rarely do we see changes happening at this pace that have been happening here in Qatar. But the government would always point to this being, or these reforms being, very much aligned with their national vision, and I think that's something that we have to be very conscious of as well. If these reforms are perceived as only being driven by international interests or international pressure, campaign from outside, to what extent is it going to be sustainable? If it's seen more as, well, this is needed as part of developing a more competitive economy, attracting foreign talent, attracting foreign investment, then it really has, it's more embedded within a national set of priorities, and indeed will have a longer term impact.
So that ties in a bit also this point that James was raising in terms of differentiating between what is feasible, what is possible, and what isn't, and also maybe expectation management leading up to certain events, but also moving away from just these events. Max, I'd like to follow up on something that struck me in terms of how accessible the ILO seems to be. I don't know whether that's a special feature that you have in Doha, because it sounds like you're in touch, you've got a large network, but you're accessible, especially for those affected by or whose rights are being abused, so they come and address you. Unfortunately, our colleague from Amnesty wasn't able to join us today, but I'm wondering whether that's something that kind of makes the ILO stand out in comparison to other organizations. I also understand, following up what James was saying, that, well, yes, workers' rights might not be something that would question or change the political structure. It's not something that would question it, and maybe other organizations, the reforms they're calling for would. But is that something that makes the ILO special, this accessibility and also the network that you've got? And do you see that happening with other human rights groups? Do they have similar structures in place?
Yeah, actually, it's pretty unique within the ILO. Well, I mean, usually the ILO offices around the world don't receive complaints directly from workers. And indeed, it's not something that we advertise. We don't want to replace the government complaints mechanisms. The first thing we will ask workers is, have you already filed a complaint with the Ministry of Labor? This can be done, as I said, online, on workers' phones. It can also be done anonymously. If workers feel that they don't want to draw attention to themselves, they can do this through a whistleblower channel. So we're not looking to replicate, but really this has been useful in terms of making sure that we do get a sense of where the gaps and challenges still remain. And there are other institutions in the country, like the National Human Rights Committee, that would do this, but I don't believe there's any other international organizations, any human rights groups. I mean, the government does, when they speak to these groups, say, and they receive complaints directly from them, but because they don't necessarily have a presence, a physical presence or an office here on the ground, it's a different kind of engagement, interaction that they would have with workers. It would be by email only, for example. Yeah, but what we've seen is that it's in general, when major reforms came in, especially around kafala, we did see a spike in the number of cases that we were seeing workers struggling to access the system or coming with a lot of questions about what's the process and procedures. Happy to report that we've seen the numbers of issues around changing employers, retaliation, unpaid wages that decrease, but many of the issues that we receive here are then the more complicated cases, the ones that are more difficult for workers to resolve, the governments to resolve. So the point I'm trying to make is that what we see here in the office is not necessarily representative of the situation as a whole, but it gives us a feel.
James, since you were the one who was raising the issue that, human or workers' rights are not, they don't question or in any way seek to change the political system in place, but obviously other human rights would or demanding that. Can you say a little more? Because from what we're hearing from Max, the labor rights, there is progress to be seen. That is obviously it's not going to happen from one day to the next, but you've given us quite a positive assessment, I would say, especially for the migrant workers. But James, could you say a little something maybe about other human rights areas, aspects, because you'd also already mentioned the LGBTQ rights, for example, or could you just give maybe some thoughts on that? Sorry, and you're still muted.
Yeah. Okay. Let me give you two answers. One very specific, and one I think a broader contextual answer. I think there's no doubt that certainly on paper, and often also in practice, workers' rights and the conditions under which they work and live have been significantly improved as a result of the reforms. Implementation has been a problem, but then Qatar has an implementation problem across the board. It's not just simply with the implementation of labor reforms that they have accepted. Take their foreign policy initiatives. Qatari foreign policy is, among other things, mediation driven. You can bring people to the table, but you've also got to have the bodies to follow up. And what you've seen with some of the initially successful Qatari mediation efforts, that's where it began to falter. I think what you saw at the initial phases of the campaign to address workers' rights, that demands, what I mentioned earlier, demands were being put forward for for collective bargaining and for independent trade unions. Those are things that only work in an open political system. They do not work in an autocratic system. And at the end of the day, whichever way you want to turn it, Qatar is an autocracy. It may be a slightly more enlightened or somewhat more enlightened autocracy than, for example, Saudi Arabia, but it is an autocracy. And so those were demands. And I'm not saying that the human rights groups or the trade unions that at the time were putting forward their demands were out for regime change. I don't think they were out for regime change. What I'm saying is I'm not sure that they fully understood what the consequence of those demands would be. Now, Qatar is also different in maybe less so in comparison to a country like Kuwait, but by and large, Qatar, in contrast to most other Gulf states, has this ethos of demanding or standing up for rights. It, by and large, talks the talk, but it doesn't walk the walk. So it has raised issues of press freedom, but when the institution that they founded to promote press freedom and to help journalists that were in dire straits got too critical of Qatar, that institution didn't last very long. On the other hand, Qatar is the only Gulf state that has an asylum law. I mean, I have a theory of why Qatar is more willing to talk the talk, or, for example, in contrast to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, supported the popular Arab revolts in 2011, or most of them at least, which goes too far to go into now, but goes back to the very early days of the founding of the state, and the role of certain figures in that. But nonetheless, it has a different ethos on these issues, even if that is not an ethos that in any acceptable extent is being implemented.
All right, looking at the time, I would ask our audience if they'd like to pose questions to already start either indicating that in the chat by writing a number 1, then we would ask you, I'll call your name and you can pose your question, or if you prefer, you can simply write your question in the chat. And while you're doing that, I would like to ask you, James and Max, a question on, because we've been talking about now states and also the ILO as an international organization, but also human rights groups, but we haven't spoken about FIFA yet, and I'd be interested to hear from you your reaction to their this legacy fund which they've created. But as I saw, also Qatar also has a fund for workers' support, I saw. Can I just have a short assessment from both of you? Yeah, what is that worth, let's say, in terms of FIFA owning up to, or just seeing what the result maybe was, or what their contribution can be to the topic of human rights and World Cup or sports mega events. Max, maybe you'd like to go first.
Sure. I mean, I'm not on top of the latest what FIFA planning, but I can say that definitely in the run up to the World Cup, and even since, there have been calls for Qatar to establish a remedy fund for workers who have lost their lives, or paid recruitment fees, or suffered from unpaid wages in the run up to the World Cup. The government responded that they do have mechanisms and systems in place to address this, particularly when it comes to unpaid wages. And indeed, a law was established in 2018 to establish what they call a Workers' Support and Insurance Fund, which would pay out workers when they get a court ruling in their favor. Usually, in most cases, they do. There is, when it comes to wages, because you have to have your wages paid into a bank account, there should be a transaction of how much you were paid, when you were paid, or if you were paid. And that's usually the paper trail that judges need in labor courts. So 80+% of labor courts rule in favor of workers. And then with this, workers can seek to be made whole from the Workers' Fund. Now, there are challenges around the implementation here. And on the one hand, the government as of the end of last year had paid out $350 million from this fund, which is a huge amount. But that also points to the extent of the problem, of the structural issues when it comes to wage protection. Other challenges have been that because there are so many demands on this fund, the threshold was put on how much the fund could pay out to an individual worker. And so workers who have accrued or have claims that exceed a certain threshold wouldn't benefit from this fund and have to pursue it through another court system. So there are still challenges, but the government is looking at how it can enhance these the functioning of this fund. In my view, we have to go a few steps back and go back to the wage protection system, that unlike the mechanism through which workers must be paid through their bank accounts. And when violations are detected, then the penalties must be enacted a lot sooner, rather than waiting 3-4 months while the amounts accumulate, the amounts owed accumulate. So as in many of these issues, it's a glass half full or glass half empty, depending on your perspective. The systems are there. The systems still need to be definitely fine-tuned. Sorry, and one more point I should add, that the government did also acknowledge that this fund would be available for workers who had accident and injury claims as well, that it could be used for that in addition to the issue of unpaid wages. But I don't think we've got a case of that being tested as yet.
I think Max is probably much better equipped than I am to talk about the fund, but I think it's important to look at the overall environment in which FIFA was operating over the last decade. I think one of the complicating factors in the whole Qatar debate was that you had an information war going on. And it was an information war, particularly between the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, and all of those differences then sort of came to a pinnacle in 2017 when the UAE and Saudi Arabia led the diplomatic and economic boycott of Qatar, which lasted for 3.5 years and was lifted in 2021. Part of that battle was playing out in FIFA, in which you had essentially an indirect investment, a substantial indirect investment, somewhere around $40 billion, that was designed to try and create new competitions within FIFA, which would have changed the balance of power in terms of governance, and would have brought the Saudis and the Emiratis, put them in a much more influential position. And FIFA at that moment was playing both ends against the middle because it wanted that investment. Its problem was that a lot of the national federations didn't want the competitions. And ultimately the whole thing sort of didn't all pan out. But with other words, FIFA was a player, or a playground, if you wish, in a much more larger geopolitical battle in which it was trying to take as much advantage of it as it could.
All right, then I would leave our conversation at that for now and open up to questions and comments from the audience. I see, so again, so if you'd like to comment or join the conversation, simply write a 1 in the chat. Otherwise, you can also simply type your questions in the chat. I see that we've got Tani Franz already asking kind of a more general question also to the audience, since we've now heard Max and James' assessment of what the progress has been on human rights since the World Cup in Qatar. Maybe there are some other assessments. I also saw, like I mentioned earlier, we've got participants in the audience from different organizations, some with a focus on the Middle East, but also from human rights or other international organizations. So if you'd like to join the conversation, please just write a 1 in the chat or ask your questions there. Maybe someone would like to respond to Tani Franz's comment. Umar, I see you've raised your number 1, so please go ahead.
Hello everyone, thanks for the presentation. I would like to start with James. I could not agree more when you took a very balanced approach, coming with the perspective that, okay, it was a very successful human rights campaign, which highlighted the labor rights violation in Qatar, which is actually very much present in Qatar. And Max also commented that they have reformed since then. The one positive thing that came out of the campaign is that it hit the issue which was actually there in Qatar. But I would like to go back to the skepticism, which we also had, and you also lightly mentioned that, okay, the campaign was successful, but it was based on prejudice and biased emotions, and that was felt around the globe. And also, if you are sitting here in the Western part and you see your colleagues even boycotting, watching football game here on television, you see that is it really the sincere outburst or sincere, you know, uh, protest for the human rights violation in Qatar, or it is a bias or a Western prejudice against against the East, against the Gulf countries? And when we see that there are also human rights violations at the same time happening in Palestine, in Pakistan, in Turkey, in the Muslim parts of China, like Xinjiang, in Somalia, in Ethiopia, and why is this a cherry pick process that, okay, one country gets more traction when it comes to human rights violations as compared to other countries? While at the same time, there was also a hue and cry in Afghanistan. You know, there was also a fresh wound. So the more traction should have been channeled to Afghanistan rather than to Qatar. So then here is what I draw the line of caution when I see that whether a campaign is based on sincere protest or it is a more politically motivated campaign, prejudice based or West, phobia. Uh, do you see that this campaign was also a cherry pick process?
Let me make 3 points. One, uh, I agree with Max that there's been substantial labor reform. That doesn't mean that all the problems have been resolved, and I think that Max correctly pointed out. But there's been substantial change, and there's substantial change still needed. So I think that's point one. Point two, let me just correct. I think you may have misunderstood me. What I did not say was that the campaign for human rights, for workers' rights, for LGBTQ rights was based on bias, on prejudice, on sour grapes. I said the debate about Qatar was skewed by segments of by one segment of participants in that debate who were driven by bias, by prejudice, and by sour grapes. I don't think that's true for the human rights organizations. What I did say is that the human rights organizations, and in my mind, but again, I'll bow to Max on this, also the trade unions, did not distance themselves in clear and continuous ways from that segment of the debate that was biased and prejudiced. I think the third point leads to a more fundamental issue. And I don't know what the answer to this question is. So human rights activists, probably a significant amount of the academic community, of the journalistic community, would argue that human rights have to be a factor in the awarding of the rights to host a mega event. And in fact, part of what changed as a result of the Qatari World Cup, or the awarding of the hosting rights to Qatar, was that FIFA felt obliged to adopt a human rights policy. The problem here is that there's no country on earth that has a perfect human rights record. Think of European migration policies. Think of the issues of the Black community in the United States. And so how do you apply that human rights policy? I don't know what the answer to that is. Now, I think a lot of people are going to look at the 2026 World Cup, which is being held in North America, with particularly Mexico having serious human rights issues. And call it what you want, a crisis of liberalism, a crisis of democracy, whatever it is, Western democracy going through a crisis. And how do you address those issues? So a lot of people will look at what the human rights groups are going to be doing towards the 2026 World Cup, and we'll see. But I think that they're beyond the issue of what many would perceive to be hypocrisy or double standards is a fundamental problem on how do you apply this in a world in which you don't have a state that fully adheres to human rights. It doesn't matter what country you look at.
I think from my side, I would say that certainly we felt that the conversation running up to the World Cup would have benefited from more nuance. And we've accepted all invitations to participate in all dialogues to try and provide some of that nuance. And what we've noticed is that individuals or institutions that have been trying to provide a bit of this nuance and context to talk about how these are all changes that have happened in a relatively short period of time, in just a matter of years, to talk about how Qatar has a very distinct labor market that you cannot compare with many other countries around the world, but maybe only those in the neighborhood, with 95% of the private sector being foreign workers. But there has been, in many times, in many instances, those voices who were providing nuance and context were silenced, or people felt that they didn't want to speak out because they would be attacked and criticized for what would be perceived as giving Qatar a free pass or something like that. I think nobody is suggesting that the reforms are not significant. Nobody is suggesting that the work is finished. There's a whole lot of gray area in these debates, and it is complicated, as with everything. There is a need for more subtlety. But that I felt wasn't always present in the run-up to the World Cup. To the question from Tani, if I may, I think just a note about the ILO's presence here. We are in this iteration, in this format, we'll continue to work in Qatar until the end of this year, and we are in discussions with the government of Qatar about a longer-term presence. This was a request that was made by the government of Qatar to open up a permanent office in the country. So that's ongoing, and we've been working since the World Cup with the ministry on a whole range of initiatives to continue the work to enhance the implementation of the reform. We are not anticipating major new legislative announcements. That's not the focus at the moment. In some ways, the systems, the institutions, the awareness raising, everything is catching up with the laws that have already been adopted. But there are also, a number of new initiatives ongoing. I mean, one of the things that I think is really noteworthy that we are now preparing is an international conference on heat stress, on occupational heat stress. As I mentioned, this was a reform that was undertaken in May of 2021. It really enhances protections and has shown to have an impact. And what we saw last summer was globally around the Northern Hemisphere, there was heat waves that were affecting workers in all parts of the world. So, in May, in a couple of weeks, we'll be gathering the leading experts from around the world to, present the research, bringing together countries from the Arab world also to see how this research may affect policy changes in other countries, including in Qatar. What more can Qatar do to better protect workers from heat stress? But this, I hope, will be also an example of how these reforms will have a ripple effect beyond just the borders of Qatar.
since I currently don't see any other questions in the chat, I'll take the make use of my privilege as the moderator to ask you a question to follow up on a topic we had when we were preparing this talk, namely, well, we've only touched upon the issue of the media and how the media reported about the World Cup, but also human rights. And I remember, Max, you were saying something about whom you received interview requests from. So maybe Max and James, you could also say a little about the role of the media in this whole topic, also in the follow-up.
Do you want me to go first? Okay. Look, I think one's got to be very specific what we're talking about here. When people talk about the media, they're talking about the Western media. And I think that's the point that Max will probably make. The Western media is not some homogeneous bunch. It's, if you wish, I would very broadly and very schematically break it down into three categories. You have the tabloid media. You have conservative media. And if, for example, you look at the Telegraph in London, it had a very strong anti-Qatar bias in its reporting. And then you have the progressive media, the Guardian, or let's say not, in the case of the Guardian, the progressive media, in the case of newspapers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, liberal media. And I think it's a mixed bag. I'll give you an example of what I was thinking of when I said the debate was skewed. And I mean, the Guardian's been a focal point of media coverage because of numbers. You know, was it 6,500 dead, and so on and so forth. And I don't want to get into the numbers game. But the Guardian has a columnist who I would call rabidly racist, who described Qatar as a cannibalistic country. Now, there's a lot of bad things you can say about Qatar, which are totally justified, but cannibalism is not one of those. Now, let me be clear. I don't dispute the right, even if I fundamentally disagree with him, the right of this columnist to publish whatever he wants, to say whatever he wants. That's his freedom of expression. But I do think that the Guardian had also freedom to whether to publish or not. And in my mind, made a wrong decision there. Now, the last thing I want to say on this is a question of expectations. When people say the media did this, the media did that, they're talking about influential Western media. All of these media, even when they have an international branch like CNN International, are ultimately local or national media. That's where their audience is. The New York Times is a New York newspaper. The Wall Street Journal historically is the only national newspaper in the United States, which also had international editions. New York Times did that through the International Herald Tribune. But ultimately, they are local newspapers. They are local or national publications. The Guardian is a national British publication. That's who their audience is. And that's what's going to shape their reporting. That's going to shape what interests them and what they believe interests their readers. They're not global papers that take on a global responsibility. And yet that is often the expectation that is involved in some of the evaluation of how the media reports.
Yeah, just a few reflections in terms of our engagement with the media. As I said, we speak to everybody who approaches us. What we definitely found was that the vast majority of media attention came from Northern Europe, from selected countries in Northern Europe, followed to a lesser extent from the US. Very little engagement with the Asian media, even countries that were participating in the World Cup, or Latin American media. Some, but not much. But by far, the countries in Northern Europe. And, I think we've tried to, always present the, as full a picture as we can. And what we've seen is that in those briefings, we may say exactly the same thing, but one journalist would pick certain quotes and focus on one aspect, and another journalist would pick other quotes and focus on another aspect. So in some cases, the ILO has been perceived as being very critical of Qatar, and other times it's been painted as being too positive about Qatar when we've given exactly the same briefing to journalists. That's been our experience. But in general, what we're trying to do is be as open as possible. And you'll see from our website also, we publish a lot about what we're doing, what we've done, what we're doing in Qatar.
All right, since there are no further questions or comments in the chat, I would maybe follow up on what Umar was asking about this cherry picking, or when do human rights receive more attention? And one could argue, well, in terms of, or in the situation of the World Cup, that did, at least from some areas, draw attention to human rights issues. And so maybe as a final question to the two of you, the pros and cons of these sports mega events for human rights and drawing attention, it seems to be doing that, if nothing else, but it does draw attention. Is that the assessment that you would draw as well? And James, you had said when we were preparing also to rather look forward or look into the future of what these sports mega events mean in terms of creating awareness, which I think the ILO is also doing, obviously, as an ongoing process, not just when there's a sports mega event that takes place.
Look, I think the issue with drawing attention is sure, but if attention doesn't lead to results, what's the value of the attention? I think that in the case of Qatar, it led to results, but one reason it led to results was because the Qataris believed that they had an interest in accommodating and producing certain results. We could just as well have had a World Cup where nothing had changed. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's, I think that drawing attention is part of a larger strategy. And sure, there's nothing wrong with drawing attention, but the ultimate evaluation of what that attention is worth is really an evaluation of what did it produce. Mm-hmm.
Max, would you want to add anything or leave it at that?
No, I think just very briefly to say that things have really changed a lot in recent years. I remember just a few years ago, there was the debate about whether sports and politics should mix was still ongoing, and I think Qatar put that to rest in that it was very much front and center for many parts, for many countries, many media organizations and other institutions. What I would also say is that Qatar's World Cup, as I said, has accelerated a lot of reforms, and this will be, perhaps the first time. I think it's the first time that a mega sporting event has had this kind of legacy. Especially we can continue down this path and ensure that that all workers can benefit from these reforms. I think that's something that we can point to, and that future hosts of mega sporting events will be asked to do similar things at Qatar, and whether they do or not is I think depends on the country context. That depends on whether it aligns with national interests, as was mentioned before, and a whole range of other factors. But for sure, I think this has been, in many ways, the first time such a big agenda around rights has been linked to a mega sporting event.
Okay, we've actually got two more questions in the chat now. There's a representative of the German Arab Friendship Association. So the DFG, I'll ask you to raise your question first, and then we'll have Umar again. We can't hear you yet. Your microphone's on, but we can't hear you, unfortunately. Otherwise, perhaps write your question in the chat and we'll move on to Umar again.
Thank you. So there is one last question I want to put before the panelists. Should the sporting event, should it be coupled with the political issues, be it the human rights issues or other political issues? Like the sporting event is something very different. Like the global sporting event, like the World Cup, should it be coupled with the human rights issue, or should it be used as a means to project the human rights violations on this occasion? Or in other words, we also saw the display of some protest of the participating football teams, namely the German football team. Uh, how do you guys think it is the right thing to do on a playing field where your intention is to be in a sporting mood or to entertain the crowd around the globe, and then it becomes suddenly politically controversial by taking or projecting something that might be appealing to some and offending to others. Thank you.
Do you want me to answer?
I think you're best placed for that one, Jim.
Okay, I'm not sure I understood the question correctly, but let me point out two things. One is something I said earlier, that I think it's very difficult, and I don't know what the answer is to how do you apply human rights standards. But I think that if I understood your question correctly, I think it goes to a much more fundamental issue. And that is that international sports associations live in a world of fiction. And it's a fiction that they, together with others, have deliberately created. The fiction is that sports and politics are separate. They're not. They're joined at the hip like Siamese twins, and they're inseparable. And so the real question is not whether they're separate, but how do you manage that relationship? In many ways, the way you manage other complicated relationships, like an independent regulator for a financial system, or in the United Kingdom, the only country in the world that has privatized water assets, not just the management of water, and has an independent regulator that regulates the industry, or some sort of code of conduct, whatever the answer may be. But I think that one way of trying to address these issues, including the human rights issues, in a more transparent and more honest way, is to finally, bust this balloon of that these issues are separate. And let's keep in mind, human rights is a political issue. It's also a human issue and a humanitarian issue, but it's first and foremost a political issue.
Then we'll give the DIFG another chance to ask their question. They seem to have a microphone now, so go ahead, please.
Hello, can you hear me now? I'm an intern at the DIFG, so this question isn't coming directly from the DIFG. I was going to ask, I think one of you mentioned that Saudi Arabia, excluding their bid for the 2030 World Cup, they're only hosting competitions from the Asia, the hosting competitions from Asia. I was going to ask, do you think that maybe this could have something to do with the fact that Qatar got such negative backlash from hosting the World Cup, and that they then had to change certain workers' rights, which might have not been so profitable for the people in charge in Qatar? Or yeah, and maybe that Saudi Arabia is only trying to, I guess, get the positive benefits from a major sports event happening in their country, that being further international recognition, people noticing them as someone on the world stage, and more countries seeing them as, I guess, a sports nation rather than simply what I believe most countries would see first, that being a nation whose economy is mostly driven by oil exports.
Sorry, I was the one that made the point about the Asian competitions. Let me correct it to fundamentally that statement stands. The Saudis have also engaged in wrestling in extreme sports, which are global competitions, although primarily Western competitions, but nonetheless. I think what the Saudis are doing, one has to see in a larger context. The sports industry is one major pillar of Mohammed bin Salman's reform plans and economic diversification plans. So I think that's one driver. The other driver, I think, is that Saudi Arabia is in competition, first and foremost, with the United Arab Emirates, less so with Qatar, on replacing the UAE as the hub for anything and everything in the Gulf. You've had the issue of companies that want to do business in Saudi Arabia with the government being obliged by next year to move their headquarters, if they have those, in Dubai, from Dubai to Saudi Arabia. You have the issue of restrictions on imports from UAE free trade zones. You have issues over oil policy and potentially the UAE following Qatar's example and leaving OPEC. So I think that the Saudi sports drive is really driven by a multitude of factors. One of those factors is positioning on the international stage. Obviously, if you're, let's face it, diplomacy has changed. The days of men in striped pinstriped suits sipping champagne at cocktail receptions being the mainstay of diplomacy are over. It's public diplomacy, it's cultural diplomacy, it's people-to-people diplomacy. Countries are ranked in their ability, in their performance on the sports field, and they're ranked in terms of their ability to host a mega event like the World Cup. And it's as much for Saudi Arabia about that, particularly if it's trying to attract foreign investment, if it's trying to attract foreign talent, for example.
Thank you, James. Then looking at the time and considering that we're in different time zones, and James, you were very generous in offering to join tonight, even though I think you're the most advanced in terms of time zones.
Yeah, but I'm used to that.
Okay. James and Max, I would just ask both of you for maybe a short final statement on next steps or what you expect from these sports mega events in the future, or maybe just the final also take just on your own role, your own also area of focus or interest that maybe has been shaped, or maybe some points that have been raised that you will now pay more attention to through the World Cup, maybe something like that as a final statement. Max, would you start, and then we'll close today with James.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Katerina, and thanks again for bringing us together. Yeah, I mean, finally, I just want to emphasize that, you know, from the part of the ILO, we continue in this technical cooperation with the government of Qatar as well as other partners here. We know that there's work to be done. The ILO has this kind of dual function. On the one hand, we are in a technical cooperation agreement with the state of Qatar. At the same time, we have still our responsibilities when it comes to overseeing compliance with international labor standards. So the ILO's independent committee of experts continues to make comments on the application of various international labor standards that Qatar has ratified. And you know, these point to, you know, gaps and challenges, and there's full recognition from all parties that, you know, this is work in progress. But as I said before, you know, we feel that this, you know, when we look at where we were in 2017, where we are now, where things are progressing on a positive trajectory, and you know, now that we are in a post-World Cup environment, you know, the dynamics may change in terms of international media attention. We expect there to be less scrutiny or spotlight on our work. Nevertheless, this work is longer term and linked to longer term objectives. So I would encourage everybody to, you know, to kind of stay abreast of what's happening in Qatar through the work that we're doing the work we're doing, which is published on the website, through the comments of the independent committee of experts. But we fully expect that we'll continue to work with Qatar in the years to come to ensure that all workers can benefit from the reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max and James.
I think primarily what I'll be looking at is what lessons potential host countries draw, and what lessons do, and whether they draw lessons from this, and the same in terms of activists. Now, the one thing I should say is when I started my syndicated column 13 years ago, I called it The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer. And what I was doing was looking at broader political developments through the prism of soccer or football. I should confess that I'm not a sports fan. I couldn't care less about the sport, and I don't follow it. I've recently changed, because my focus was through the prism of soccer on geopolitics. I've actually recently dropped the Middle East soccer from the title of the column, which doesn't mean that I don't write regularly, and I publish 2 or 3 times a week. That I don't write regularly about sports, but it's one aspect of what I do. You know, so if I'm writing about politics of sport, I'm writing just as much about the politics of religion, for example.
Well, thank you very much, James and Max, for your insight that you shared with us this evening.